is our second session on change management. In the previous session we looked at what is change management. We looked at the various forces, internal forces, the external forces that give rise to change. In this session we are going to look at several things. We are going to look at individuals, specifically their behavior, and we are going to try and understand what would be a behavioral approach to change. But behavioral approach to change and change management is not the only way of looking at the entire domain area. There are other approaches like the cognitive approach, the psychodynamic approach, the Gestalt approach, and so on. So we will be looking at various approaches, and then we will try to understand how these differ from each other. Our interest is not on change management in isolation, but on change management with respect to e-governance. What happens when a department, when a government organization introduces an e-government initiative? What kind of changes are involved in it? How does one manage a change of this nature? It's very clear that individuals who interact with citizens, individuals who work on computer systems, who look at screens, who print out certificates, they are all individuals who are involved in this e-government process. So one aspect or one dimension of change will look at individuals and how they react, or what they feel about change. But individuals don't work in isolation in an organization, so we will also need to look at go beyond individuals and look at how team impacts change. The team behavior is quite different from individual behavior. So we will look at individual behavior, we need to look at team behavior, and then we have to look at an organization as a whole and look at organizational change. What would you say is a behavioral approach to change? As the name itself indicates, this approach focuses on how one individual can change another individual's behavior using rewards and punishment, obviously to achieve intended results. So that is our definition of behavioral approach to change. If the intended results are not achieved, then an analysis of the individual's behavior is required, and this analysis will lead to understanding what contributes to success and what contributes to non-achievement of the intended goals. In order to elicit the preferred behavior, the individual must be encouraged to behave in a particular way and discouraged to behave in several other ways. So if I am going to implement an e-government initiative in my organization, then I want individuals to be favorable towards it. I want the officials, the staff at various levels to support the initiative, to be positive about it. And I would want them not to behave in a certain way. I would want them not to be negative about it. I would want them not to be afraid of it. So in the behavioral approach, one seeks to support the positive and then reduce or suppress the negative aspects. An organization undergoing a planned change where it wants to move from an inward focused bureaucratic organization to a flatter and more responsive customer oriented organization would be a good example of what the goal of an e-government initiative would be. From a pure behavioral point of view, what I would need to do is to look at all the customer facing and the back office staff to change the way that they have to change the way they behave. In the past they used to be highly bureaucratic. Now I want them to be citizen facing, so I need them to change their ways. So this approach, the behavioral approach, will focus on the behavior of the staff and the managers, perhaps to the exclusion of other dimensions of change. For instance, I may not give enough attention to processes, I may not give enough attention to improving relationships, I may not, or to increasing involvement in goal setting. So these are things that I may not focus if my approach to change is a pure native behavioral approach. In what ways will behavioral approach help us? Or rather, let me phrase it differently. In what ways will I implement this behavioral approach? The first thing would be to identify the behaviors that impact performance. The second step would be to measure these behavior. What is the extent to which certain behaviors dominate other kinds of behavior? So I would actually need to measure the behavior. The third step would be a functional analysis of behavior, that is identification of the component parts that make up the behavior, because we know behavior is a complex subject. Fourth step would be the generation of a strategy for intervention. We already mentioned early in this session that the whole approach would be to promote certain behavior and suppress certain behavior. So the step 4 would be to come out with a strategy for intervention. And step 5, as with most management cycles, would be evaluation of the effectiveness of the intervention strategy. We don't have to go through all of these steps in detail, this being an introductory session on change management, but what kind of reinforcements are possible? We can readily think of two types. One would be the financial reinforcement. So this is traditionally financial reinforcement has been the most explicit of the reinforcement mechanism used in organizations, particularly in very market oriented cultures, where there are bonus payments, where there are increments, where there are promotions and so on. To be effective, the financial reinforcement needs to be very clearly and very closely and very visibly linked to the behaviors and performance that the organization requires. If this doesn't exist, this condition is not satisfied, then the financial rewards don't work very well. An organization wide performance bonus, which is unrelated to individuals' contribution, will be an example of a very poorly linked reinforcement, because I wouldn't know, everybody benefits, I don't know why I am being financially rewarded. Then there are non-financial reinforcement. One can debate which is better, one can debate whether one should use both. What would be examples of non-financial reinforcement? Feedback. This is one of the most common and easiest forms of reinforcement, where a feedback is given to an individual about performance on specific tasks. The more specific the feedback is, the more impactful the reinforcement will be. This feedback can be both positive or negative. So I have this employee who is in charge of the application development on the e-governance project. If the performance is not, if there are a lot of delays, if there are a lot of bugs, and then this individual is responsible for it, then I can call him or her aside and then be very specific and say, these A, B, C, D, these are the areas where the individual has done well or not done well. Similar to feedback, but different from it, is another form of reinforcement. This would be the social reinforcement. This takes the form of interpersonal actions, that is communication, either positive or negative, praise, compliment, general recognition, perhaps greater or lesser attention to particular behavior and outcome. So these would be the social reinforcement. Awards. People do react to respond very well to public recognition, especially if it is a positive one. Since we are still on the subject of individuals and behavior, one aspect that we need to consider is motivation. Motivation and behavior. This behavioral approach, the behaviorist view of the world, has been prevalent in the management literature and practice for a long time, perhaps from late 50s and early 60s onwards. A pure behaviorist view has led to problems of difficulties with motivating people to exhibit the right behavior. So this has led researchers to investigate what styles work and what styles do not work. In 1960, Douglas McGregor published his book, The Human Side of Enterprise. Many of you perhaps are familiar with McGregor and his work. He is credited with Theory X and Theory Y, which looked at the underlying management assumptions. I repeat, underlying management assumptions about an organization's workforce. Theory X and Theory Y. What were the Theory X assumptions? That people don't like work, they dislike work, they need control, they need and direction, they require authority, they avoid taking responsibility, they lack ambition. So these were the views held under the Theory X by the management. Theory Y lies at the other extreme. So people regard work as natural and normal. They respond more than just to control. They respond to recognition. They seek inner fulfillment. They can be creative and innovative. So these would be the Theory Y assumptions. So a management style which favors the behavioral approach has to be careful when implementing e-government solutions, and the management, especially the project leaders, the project sponsors, have to ask themselves, are they either consciously or subconsciously subscribing to one of these views, Theory X, Theory Y, and these have major impact on how the individuals will respond to an e-government initiative. To what extent will individuals support it? The other approach, which is different from behavioral approach, is what is called as a cognitive approach. As opposed to behavioral approach, the cognitive approach suggests that we pay attention to the way in which we talk about ourselves. We talk to ourselves about the results. The cognitive psychology, this cognitive approach developed out of frustration with the behaviorist approach. The behaviorist approach focused solely on the observable behavior, whereas the cognitive psychologists were more interested in learning about developing the capacity for language and the capacity for a person for problem solving. They were interested in things which happen within a person's brain. So these are internal processes which behavioral psychologists did not focus on. I think this is something that you and I can relate to from our personal experience, from our personal life also. After a particularly good performance, one person might say such things like, I knew I could do it. I'll be able to do it again. Another person might say, that was lucky. I doubt whether I'll be able to repeat this performance. So we are now looking not at a behavioral externally driven reinforcements, we are looking at our own mental makeup in a cognitive sense. So understanding the cognitive aspects of behavior is very critical to change management. Same applies to poor performance. So there might be a poor performance. One person might say, I could do a lot better next time. Another person might say, I knew it. I knew it will turn out like this. So kind of a negative attitude. Once we have identified our usual way of talking to ourselves, we can look at how these internal conversations with ourselves limit us, and then consider changing the script. Think about it, food for thought. Reflect upon a time when you did not achieve one of your results. What did you say to yourself? What was limiting your belief? Do you think you'll be able to hold a new belief for the same event? What was your behavior to your original belief, and what might your behavior be to this new belief? What results do you think this new belief will bring about? Think about it. There are techniques for cognitive change, just as there are techniques for behavioral change, there are techniques for cognitive change. These include positive listings. So simply list all the positive qualities you have, such as good feelings, good experiences, good results, good skills, good knowledge, good expertise. By accepting these are all part of you as an individual, you can reinforce all these positive thoughts, feelings and perceptions. And this reinforcement of your own positive listing can lead to more positive and more enhanced beliefs. So positive listings is one way of one technique for bringing about cognitive change. Visualization is similar to listing, except that you focus on positive mental images, where you enter into a relaxed mode and then imagine a specific example of the way you want to be positively, I'm saying. The third technique is what is called reframing. Reframing is a technique for reducing feelings and thoughts that impact negatively on performance. we looked at, if you recall, in one of our earlier sessions on risk management, we looked at how framing impacts our perception of risk. If you recall from that session, we understood that we react in a particular way to positive things, to gains for instance, and we react entirely differently to losses. We want sure gains, we don't want sure losses, but we are willing to take a chance, and then we are willing to look at probabilities on losses. And we saw from that session that the way I describe a problem, the way I describe a situation, the way I describe a requirement, either in positive gain terms or in loss terms, I can actually reframe the whole issue, and then it can have a different kind of impact. It can elicit different kind of behavior from the audience to whom it is presented. So reframing is a good technique and very useful technique for looking at oneself and then supporting the change management endeavor. Think about it. How would you rate the behavioral approach which we talked about and the cognitive approach? Which one do you prefer? Can they both go hand in hand? What do you see as limitation of the cognitive approach? Think about it. We have talked about behavioral approach, we have talked about cognitive approach. Let's look at what is called as a psychodynamic approach to change. The idea that humans go through a psychological process during change became evident through many research initiatives. One of them merits special mention, the one done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969-70. The word psychodynamic is based on the idea that when facing change in the external world, an individual can experience a variety of internal psychological states. As with behavioral and cognitive approaches that we talked about, the psychodynamic approach also begins not in the arena of organization, but for Kubler-Ross, this research happened and these findings happened when they were working with terminally ill patients. Later research have shown that individuals going through changes within an organization can have very similar experiences, though less dramatic and less traumatic than terminally ill patients. What does an e-government initiative do? Where employees were working on manual records, where employees relied on hard copies, where employees relied a lot on their experience and intuition. What e-governance does through the use of proper balanced use of ICT is to transform the entire work environment. So you no longer work on, at least that is the ideal e-governance situation, where you no longer work through paper records. There's not a whole lot of things to catch up with. There are not a whole lot of supporting documents that need to be submitted, reviewed, and then entered in various registers. The amount of discretion available with an employee, at least to some extent, if the e-government solution is properly designed, is reduced, because most advanced ICT solutions are able to handle built-in rules, built-in so there are logic engines, there are built-in rules which are able to automate a lot of processes. The workload also looks very different in an ideal e-government setting, because a lot of data entry is required or at least expected to be done by the citizens themselves. So what do I do with the extra time that I have now as an employee? So e-governance or e-government solutions bring about very drastic change in organization. So when they bring up such drastic changes, it is not surprising that individual employees become worried. They start asking themselves, they start asking their colleagues, how is it going to impact? Kubler-Ross published her seminal work on death and dying in 1969, like I mentioned. This described her work with terminally ill patients and the different psychological stages that these terminally ill patients went through in coming to terms with their condition was described in this paper. Kubler-Ross realized that patients, given the necessary conditions, would typically go through 5 stages